Syrian opposition activists urging protesters to rally for a no-fly zone over the country. 37 people have reportedly been killed by security forces in Friday's anti-government protests, with UN figures suggesting over 3,000 have died since troubles began 7 months ago. Let's talk more about the situation now to former US diplomat to the region, John Graham. Mr. Graham, thanks ever so much for being on RT International. We appreciate your time. Can we start with Syria first of all, and this idea that's come forward now of a no-fly zone? Let's think this one through. I mean, there's no air threat from military planes towards civilians, so why ask for a no-fly zone?
Well, first of all, I think everyone should speak more clearly on this. They're not asking for a no-fly zone in reality any more than they were in Libya. They're asking for close air support, which is an entirely different thing. We all know what happened in Libya. NATO went in there to institute a no-fly zone and to protect civilians, and very quickly, within days, the mission became one of regime change. So when people call for a no-fly zone in Syria, they're really calling for close air support. As you know, the Syrians, Assad is not using his warplanes to kill the protesters. He's using his army with some help from helicopters. So what would work, what might work in Syria would be close air support, which is a much more dodgy thing. It's much more difficult, it's much more sophisticated, and there are many more risks.
So let me just get this straight. Do you think we're at all heading towards, any time soon, a Libyan-like scenario in Syria?
I don't know. And I'll tell you, there are many reasons why it won't come to that. And one of the biggest is sheer geography. Remember, in Libya, you have basically a huge desert with a few cities dotted along the coastline. So NATO warplanes had a fairly easy time in identifying enemy troops and armor and taking them out. Syria, of course, is a much more urbanized country. It's much smaller. And so the possibility of civilian casualties in Syria is enormously greater than it was in Libya. And that must be a serious concern for anyone thinking of instituting a no-fly zone.
But talking of casualties, more deaths reported after these protests earlier on today, another 37 to add to that, 3,000 plus fatalities now in Syria. What does the number have to go to and get bigger to before there's a world response to end the Syria crisis?
Good question. And it isn't just the rising casualties. The protests are continuing, and the political condemnations and the sanctions that have been instituted clearly aren't working. And a third factor which would move toward a no-fly zone or a close combat support effort would be that the opposition groups in Syria are finally coalescing. In the beginning, there were so many different groups, some of them fighting each other, that would give great pause to anyone, for example, NATO, to institute a no-fly zone. Now they're coalescing. There's a new, what do they call it, Syrian National Council. There's some cohesion, and so there's someone to work with. So there are factors plus and minus.
John, let's take a minute now to look at Libya and reflect on that a bit. NATO's wrapping up there. Its Secretary-General called the operation, quote, one of the most successful in NATO history. Is that something you agree with? You've served at the US Embassy in Libya. Do you think it was the right way forward and at the end of the day was a success?
I do. I think he was exaggerating, and it was a relatively small operation. I think NATO's efforts during the entire Cold War were far more significant. That's, of course, from NATO's point of view, not that of your country. But I think that without NATO's intervention, there would still be a bloody war going on in Libya, possibly even a civil war. And certainly NATO intervention in the beginning saved thousands of civilian lives, especially around Benghazi. It also, in a way, gave new life to NATO. NATO now has demonstrated that even though there were many imperfections in what it did, it really does have now the power to affect military solutions, if only in small and relatively unimportant places like Libya.
So where is Libya going to go, do you think, in a nutshell?
I'm optimistic. Again, I've been a diplomat for long enough to be quite cynical about these things. But the people in the Transitional Council seem to be living up to their words. Have managed to keep the whole thing from becoming a tribal war. They've appointed some relatively good people. They seem to be taking the right steps forward. So I'm optimistic that they will, in fact, after a bumpy ride, within a year or so, we might see a relatively stable, forward-looking government in Libya.
John, we're a bit tight for time, but I want to get your expert thoughts on what's happening in Egypt tonight. The gatherings there in Tahrir Square again, renewed public anger at the military rulers, who many regard as the old regime, in different clothes. Where's that going to go?
I think it's quite natural that the protesters in Tahrir Square are angry at the military because the military have done some things, for example, continuing to arrest some protesters, some heavy-handed techniques that the protesters don't much like at all. But the fact is that if the military had not stepped in and provided at least this 6 months of breathing space, then this delicate jockeying period that we're seeing now with political parties being formed, campaigns begun, the tensions being dealt with between Christian Copts and Muslims, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the secularists, all of this could have erupted into yet more violence without the army. So while I understand the strong feelings of the protesters, I understand their frustrations, I think probably history will regard this 6 months of army rule as a necessary evil that simply had to take place in order to allow the elections of the democracy we all hope will happen at the end of this year and in next year.
John Graham, really good to have you on RT International tonight, former US diplomat to Libya as you are. Thank you.
Thank you.